The following program was funded in part by Toyota, AT&T, Baldwin Richardson Foods, Lincoln Financial Group, Apple, American Airlines. A complete list is available at thehistorymakers.org. From a young boy raised in the Bronx to one of the greatest military leaders of our day, Colin Powell is an American success story. The HistoryMakers, the nation's largest African-American video oral history archive, is proud to present An Evening with Colin Powell. And now to our host, renowned journalist, Juan Williams.
The art of autobiography is at the heart of the HistoryMakers project. Tonight, we will all have the pleasure to hear from a man whose autobiography has sold more than 2 million copies. The story of Colin Powell. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming General Colin Powell. Please have a seat. Good evening. General Powell, thank you so much for being here this evening. You honor us with your presence.
Thank you very much, Juan, and I'd like to express my thanks to the HistoryMakers and to Juliana for bringing us all together this evening on this important occasion.
Now, I don't want to divulge anything too secret, but I hear you just had a birthday. Happy birthday.
Yes. Thank you very much. I'm one short of 70 now.
One short?
Yeah.
Well, don't think of it that way. To me, you're looking good.
I'm looking forward to 70.
Why?
Because I'll still be here.
You know, I remember when I first met you, you were the President Reagan's national security advisor. And what had caught my attention was a picture of President Reagan, Soviet leader Gorbachev, having a meeting up in New York City. And there were you, an African-American at a table with these world leaders.
I remember vividly, it was at Governor's Island in New York Harbor, and it was just a few weeks before President Reagan was to leave office and Gorbachev came to see him, and they had done so much together to create conditions that were bringing the Cold War to an end. And I had worked very closely, not only with President Reagan, but with President Gorbachev, so to be there at that magic moment when Gorbachev was still trying to control something that couldn't be controlled, still trying to preserve something that couldn't be preserved, the Soviet Union. And so it was a privilege to be at that meeting, and a privilege to have been with President Reagan for the 2 years that I was.
The other thing that so impressed me about you was that you're a man who's able to speak Yiddish, Jamaican accent, Southern accent, British accent, Jamaican. I mean, it doesn't stop. You can do it all.
Well, it's a product of the environment in which I grew up in the South Bronx section of New York City, where everybody was a minority of one kind or another. Eastern European, Jewish, Puerto Rican, American blacks from the South, Jamaicans, and all kinds of other West Indians. And so I picked up a little of each of that.
Now you're on the speaker circuit, you're participating in new business adventures. Can you tell us a little bit about what it's like to be Colin Powell, private citizen?
Well, it's very refreshing. It's the second time I've retired. And it's really nice to get back to being normal and not to be surrounded by people, to be able to drive yourself. The only real disadvantage is that instead of my 757, I now have the Delta shuttle. And I always have enjoyed going into retirement. In this case, I'm back in the speaking circuit, but I'm also involved in a number of business interests and some nonprofit work.
You know, one of the things that we've had in common since we've known each other is a great love of African American history. And I wonder if you would share with us a little bit about African American military history. And here I'm thinking of names like Henry O. Flipper, I'm thinking of the 10th Cavalry, I'm thinking of the Buffalo Soldiers. Buffalo Soldiers, of course, you've been involved so much with that monument out at Fort Leavenworth. But when you hear these names, how do they fit into the Colin Powell story?
Black military history is a rich history, and it's not that well known. It goes back 300 years. Blacks were always brought into military service when there was a need for additional bodies and blood. But when the conflict was over, then blacks were sent back into servitude. And it was the case in the Revolutionary War, where Washington had a number of blacks serving under him. It was the case in the War of 1812, when black men were promised their freedom and property if they fought for their country. They didn't receive that, but nevertheless, they fought. And every war we've ever been in, blacks stepped forward because it was the one place they could demonstrate equality. They weren't slaves, they weren't being oppressed. They may be in segregated units, and they may not have gotten the same pay or rations or equipment as white soldiers, but nevertheless, they were able to show that they were as brave and courageous as any other group of Americans. And they also knew that every time they did that, they would put the lie to racial discrimination to the test. With every step forward, they knew there would be progress. And it was really after the Civil War when, for the first time, blacks were allowed to remain in the military, not in an immediate time of war. And they created those 4 regiments, 2 cavalry and 2 infantry, and some of them were at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And when I went there as a brigadier general, maybe almost 100 years later, there still was no monument to them. There was a monument to Sherman and all of the other great generals of our time, and I said, where is the monument to the black soldiers that were here? It took us years, but we put that monument up. And I'm very proud of it because those black soldiers, the Buffalo Soldiers as they were known, wore the same blue uniform as a white soldier. They had brass buttons, they carried a weapon, and they had US on their collars, and they were every bit the American as their white counterparts. In fact, the Confederates started to recruit blacks, and a Confederate general wrote to Jefferson Davis and said, don't do it. Use blacks for whatever purposes you may find them useful, digging dishes, chopping trees, cooking food, doing laundry, but do not make them soldiers, because if a black man can be a soldier for the Confederacy, then the Confederacy is living a lie, and our whole theory of slavery is wrong. And he was right, it was wrong. And when a black man put on the uniform and showed that he could fight, then no question in due course he would receive equality. It took another 100 years. We had to go through the Tuskegee Airmen. We had to go through the Montford Point Marines when the Marines were finally integrated. We had to go through the Golden 13 in the Navy. Officers were finally allowed into the Navy. We had to do all of those things to reach the point that we have reached now, where the military is the most integrated institution in American society and has shown the rest of society what you can do when you give everybody an opportunity to move up based on performance. And when, yes, you do use some affirmative action, as we have over time, to redress the grievances of the past. And Exhibit A is not just myself, but all the generals who are sitting here tonight who came through that process.
In fact, Frederick Douglass made that point when he argued with President Lincoln that black people should be allowed to fight in the Union. He fought for it,
and as a result of Frederick Douglass's lobbying for it, it happened, and hundreds of thousands of blacks served during the Civil War.
You're growing up in the Bronx with your mom and dad, Maud, who was a seamstress, and I've read where she used to put together those tickets on Thursday nights so she could get paid on Friday. And then piecework. And then your dad, now your dad was only 5'3", you've told me.
He was at best 5'3", and Mom was about 5'1".
Really?
We don't need to go there, Juan.
Oh, no, don't be nervous. Don't get nervous.
They were two short people. And the family story is that I take after an aunt. a very distant aunt, and therefore I was a little taller than the rest of them. But they were two remarkable people, two very, very strong people. And everybody asks me, who are your role models? And it was these two people. But it was more than just them. I lived in a neighborhood that could best be described as a village or a tribe. It really was a tribal setup in the South Bronx section of New York, with aunts and uncles and extended family of cousins, and with neighbors and the tradespeople and the priests at our Episcopal church and the teachers in the public schools, all of us living in this little compressed.
Now this is
melting
Kelly
pot.
Street.
Kelly Street, South Bronx section.
And you go to PS-20.
PS-20, PS-39, PS-52, Morris High School.
And you describe this neighborhood as such a polyglot. But did people get along?
Yeah, they got along. It's not to say that it was perfect. I mean, it was a tenement neighborhood, and we all had to put bars on the windows and bars behind the door, and drugs had started to really come into the neighborhood at that time. But it had not yet reached that tipping point, and it was a nice family upbringing. And the big thing that I remember most vividly than anything else is the way in which all of these adults, aunts, uncles, cousins, and teachers and priests and everyone else kept the kids in play. We were not allowed to fail. It was unacceptable for anybody in my extended family to be a failure. Didn't mean you had to be a general or a doctor or a lawyer. In fact, that was the furthest thing from my mind when I was a kid in New York City. But you had to stay in school, and you had to do well, and you had to meet our expectations. We didn't come to this country for the next generation to blow it. As long as you did well, took care of your family, and as long as you didn't shame the family in any way, then this is what was expected of you. So we were never asked if we wanted to go to school. We were never asked if we wanted to go to college. It was expected. That's all there was to it.
Now you've described a strong Jamaican family. Let's take a look.
They were like other immigrants to America, coming in search of a better life. It was 1920, and Colin Powell's father, Luther Powell, came on a banana boat from Jamaica to New York. Luther would meet his future bride, Maud, while renting a room in her mother's home. They would marry and start a family. Their first child, Marilyn, would be followed by the birth of a son. Alice Graham McCoy watched Colin and Marilyn while their parents worked in New York's Garment District. The Powells would then move to Hunts Point, New York, to a neighborhood known as Banana Kelly. Here, life centered around the neighborhood, Jamaican food and culture, calypso music, St. Margaret's Episcopal Church, and home. Colin would graduate from Moores High School at age 17 and enroll at City College of New York. Here, the ROTC caught his attention. Colin came under the tutelage of Ronnie Brooks, his role model and friend. It was here as a member of the Pershing Rifles that the seeds of Colin Powell, the soldier, would be born.
So what was it about the Pershing Rifles that caught your attention?
I entered college at age 17 and went into engineering because my parents said that's where the money is, go into engineering. And no skill or aptitude for it, and so that lasted about 6 months.
I think you once told me a story about someone asking you to visualize the intersection.
Visualize a plane intersecting a cone in space. And I said, I can't do it. And then next thing you know, I was majoring in geology. But I was majoring in geology just because they wouldn't let me drop out. And I didn't have any interest in geology either. But about that time, I discovered ROTC. And I discovered this group within ROTC, the Pershing Rifles, that were quite elite. And that caught my fancy. I like the discipline, I like the uniforms, I like the sense of purpose, the sense of mission that they had, and I like the camaraderie. And I found I was pretty good at it. I give this story to youngsters all the time. Find out that what you're good at and what you love doing, and that's what you ought to be doing. So that's what I found in the Army.
What did your dad think of this? Because from the way you describe him, I think of him as a disciplinarian.
No, they pretty much knew that you would do the right thing if they guided you. So there wasn't stern discipline, but it was sort of family expectations that created the discipline.
So no anger over what happened with engineering?
No, they were disappointed, but they weren't angry. They got a little uneasy, though, when my interest went entirely in the direction of the Army. Nobody in the family had ever gone in the Army and stayed in the Army. and it looked like I was heading in that direction. But nevertheless, they were proud that I was staying in college, and 4.5 years after I began, I graduated with my Bachelor of Science in Geology and my commission to go in the Army.
Now, during this time, you went to, I think in '57, it's Fort Bragg, and for summer training, and then later you go for infantry training to Fort
Benning.
Fort Benning. So what was the first experience like at Fort Bragg, the summer training?
Well, Fort Bragg, I took the bus at the New York Port Authority bus terminal, and my father was standing on the side looking at me through the window of the bus as I headed off to North Carolina. And he swore he would never see me again. Nevertheless, I got there okay, and then driving back, I drove back with a couple of sergeants from my ROTC detachment, members of the cadre. And I learned what it was like being in the South. Fort Bragg itself was okay, but we weren't ignorant of what the South was like. And so we drove straight through, as you used to do in those days, and we hit all of the gas stations with the 3 restrooms, white men, white women, and blacks. Whatever they put over the top. Had lots of names for us in those days. And I knew that this wasn't something I could ever be happy about. I was disappointed and mad that these kinds of things happened in the country that I was getting ready to serve. But once I got back to New York, things were fine. But I was also told by my commanders that, you just do the best job you can. Don't try to change the society in the South. They were essentially saying, be a good soldier and let things change as you go forward. So they wanted me to do well, but they also wanted to make sure that I understood the social circumstances in which I was serving. But it wasn't always easy, especially after I got into the Army, and Al and I took our first trip south as a married couple in 1962, shortly after we were married. And Alma was expecting Mike, and you had to just keep driving. You didn't stop. Some people forget that there were only 2 black motels on the north-south roads in those days. And if you couldn't get to one of them, you better have a relative and a lot of chicken in the back of the car.
And infantry training? What was that like? Now, is that segregated?
No. The Army was completely integrated. In fact, an interesting story here is that if I had come in 10 years earlier, or if any of the generals here this evening had come in 10 years earlier, we never would have become generals. We sort of cut or caught the post-Truman desegregation era. Truman did it as an executive order in 1948. He integrated the military. He did it as an executive order because he never would have gotten it through Congress to change the law. But it took another 5 years for the services to truly desegregate, and they did it under the pressure of the Korean War. Most of us here tonight came in that early 50s to mid to late 50s period, when the Army looked itself squarely in the face and said, we have to do what we have been told to do, and we have to do everything we can to correct for past discrimination. As a result of that, all of us were able to be judged on the basis of our performance.
So the bus that you rode down for the summer group and for infantry training, was that an integrated group or a segregated group that rode down?
No, when you go into the South, then it was segregated.
Okay.
But coming back, of course, I drove in private cars, and that was integrated as long as you didn't try to go and eat anywhere.
And was it difficult to get into that infantry training?
No. The infantry training for me didn't turn out to be that difficult because I was well prepared for it. And I discovered that I'd picked up a pretty good education in the public school system of New York, and I could compete in the very beginning with West Pointers and others from better schools. And in the infantry school, Fort Benning, Georgia, the only color they recognize is green, infantry, and green and blue. Infantry color being blue and green being your uniform. And that's the only thing that mattered to them. And if you performed, we'll move you on. If you don't perform, we don't care what color you are.
So you're in the Army now. Germany is your first stop. So let's take a look.
Colin Powell's first assignment was Gelnhausen, Germany, a base 20 miles east of Frankfurt and a place he would return to twice again during his career. Basic training was followed by his promotion to first lieutenant and then again to captain. It was 1962, and Colin Powell would go on a blind date that would change his life. He met Alma Johnson, who was from a distinguished family of educators in Birmingham, Alabama. Their attraction was immediate, and by August, they were married. Stationed at Fort Bragg, they settled into base life, only to have Colin transferred to Saigon on Christmas Day. An injury won Colin Powell a Purple Heart. Joining his wife and newborn son Michael, Powell returned to a country in the midst of racial unrest. Birmingham was caught in the eye of a storm. 4 little girls killed at 16th Baptist Church, police dogs, civil unrest, and turmoil. All of this happening while black soldiers fought for their country in Vietnam. During Colin Powell's second tour of duty in Vietnam, he saved fellow soldiers' lives in a helicopter crash. Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1969, and Colin Powell returned to the United States. Settling in D.C., he entered business school at George Washington University, graduated, and in 1971 became a White House Fellow. Here, Colin Powell began his Washington years.
Now, a moment ago we were talking about driving south with your wife, Alma. But it would be interesting, I think, for everybody to hear how you met Alma Powell.
Met her on a blind date. A friend of mine was interested in her roommate. She was living in Boston, going to Emerson College to get her master's degree in audiology. And so my friend, Mike Henningberg, was interested in her roommate, and I was brought along to conduct a pickoff play.
The wingman, as they say.
Wingman, yeah. And I don't think Mike ever saw the girl again. But Alma and I found each other.
Well, what was it like? What did you say to her?
Well, we...
Please, baby, please?
You really... No, you really ought to have her tell the story, because she tells it better than I do. But she apparently fussed at her roommate for setting this all up. And she said, I don't date soldiers, and her father would not have approved. But when I came through the door, she says I looked so young and whatever, that she ran back into the room and put on some makeup and straightened herself up. We were married about 9 months later.
Well, one of the things that I read about Mrs. Powell is that she said she was meeting people who wanted to avoid military service, and here comes this young man who says that he wants to be in the military for a career. Yeah,
that was Boston, you may recall. And there were a lot of people then who, were avoiding, you try to not get drafted, and you certainly didn't volunteer for service, and here I come. I'm not from Birmingham, I'm not from Boston, I'm from New York, and I'm stationed at Fort Devens, Massachusetts, nearby, and I walk in, and it's not anything she ever expected, and but it worked, it clicked.
Now, as in the video we just saw, there was mention of the fact that you were in Vietnam when your first son, Michael, when your only son, Michael, was born.
Yeah, I was in the jungle along the Laotian border. I was an advisor to a Vietnamese infantry battalion, and Michael was born, and we had a system set up where I was supposed to get a notification through Red Cross, because we were way out in the jungle, and we could get on the radio maybe once every 3 days or so. And nothing came, and suddenly a little airplane came over and dropped out some mail to us. We recovered it in the jungle, and there was a letter from my mother. And she was telling me all the news of the family, and at the very end of the letter, she said, oh, by the way, we're so happy about the baby. And I, what baby? And so we got on the radio, radioed back to the base, and they had a letter from Alma waiting, and Michael had been born a couple of weeks earlier, but it was another 7 months before I saw him for the first time.
Now, we also saw in the video images of Birmingham, her hometown, which was going through such turmoil with the Civil Rights era, and then we saw a mention of the '68 assassination of Dr. King. Now, you're in Vietnam during this period.
Yeah. This 10-year period, roughly, is, I consider one of the most difficult periods in our national history. We were going through the second Civil War, first one in the 1860s, Force of Arms. And this time, we were going to do it peacefully, but we had to finally win rights for all Americans, especially African Americans. And it came at a time when we lost a president, President Kennedy. We had race riots, we had anti-war riots in the country, and then, as noted in the video, we lost Martin Luther King in April of 1968. We lost Bobby Kennedy. And a few years later, we lost the president and the vice president who had to resign in disgrace. I can tell you the Russians and the Chinese in those days thought, see, we told you, this place is going to fall apart. But we came through it because of the resiliency of our society and the fact that we have a constitutional system and that the people ultimately make the choices. But it really was a tough time, especially in the South. Alma stayed with her parents in Birmingham when I went to Vietnam the first time. She stayed the second time as well. And while I was walking in that jungle along the Laotian border, my father-in-law was standing guard with a shotgun at his house in Birmingham when the riots were taking place in 1963. I didn't know all of that. I really didn't understand all of that until I got back after being away for a whole year and seeing the turmoil that the country was in. But then we also had the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and I was able, the day after it was signed on July 4th, to go back to the hamburger joint in Fort Benning, Georgia, just outside Columbus, Georgia, the same hamburger joint that had refused to serve me 6 months earlier when I had just gotten back from Vietnam, and all I wanted was a hamburger.
Were you in uniform when they refused?
No, but they knew who I was. In fact, I was trying to set up a home in the Columbus area to bring Alma down from Birmingham with our infant son, Mike. And I was just on the way back to the base and just pulled in for a hamburger. And it was a nice young lady, but she said she couldn't serve me. She tried to help. She said, "Are you an African student?"
You should have told her you were a prince.
It might have worked. I said, "No," but she said, "Are you Puerto Rican?" "No." Are you an African student from one of the African countries serving at Fort Benning?" I said, "No." She said, "Oh, you're," I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, I'm sorry, I'm from New Jersey and I don't understand all of this, but I can't serve you. You'll have to go around the back to get your hamburger." I said, "No, thanks." And I left, but I went back on about July 5th or 6th the following year, right after the Civil Rights Bill was signed. And they served me with delight. And they needed that. They needed the law. They needed the law of the land so they could start to change hearts and minds. And we have come a long way in the last 40 years since those days, but we still have a long way to go.
Let's go back to Vietnam. We know about the turmoil here, but you're saying among the white and black soldiers there, you didn't feel the tensions?
There was tension. The Army is a reflection of the society in every manifestation of that. And so the racial problems in the United States affected the troops overseas. But because of their shared sacrifice and the need to work together, they were still able to work together as a proud force. And those young men and women who served over there, either as volunteers or draftees, did a great job for America, even though ultimately the Vietnam fell. But now, 30 years later, we are once again friends with Vietnam.
And you would hear news of Malcolm X, Dr. King. Did any of that come through to you as a soldier?
Very little of it. Some of it came through, but we were far away, and this is long before the days of the internet and live television and cable channels. But we were not unaware of these things. And we were kind of torn because we were in the military. We followed orders. We were agents of the state, the power of the state. And yet there was this turmoil. Is it Dr. King in his peaceful ways or more militant ways, such as Stokely and some of the others advocated? As I think back on that period, I think we needed both. We needed Dr. King with his message of peace and reconciliation, but we also needed some strong-willed individuals who pointed out to the rest of the country that you have to find a way forward now because the militancy could take over. And we found our way through that.
Were there many black officers in Vietnam?
Yes. In the 60s, we really started to have an infusion of black officers. And in our staff colleges and our war colleges, more and more black lieutenant colonels and colonels were being selected. Because the Army realized if you're going to have an Army that could be as high as 30% black, and it hit those numbers, it's much lower now, then you had better have an officer corps that reflects that and reflects the diversity of the country. And that's why the Army works so hard for diversity, for affirmative action, in order to show that the Army looked like the society that it reflected.
Well, in fact, now, when you're back at one point, I believe at Fort Leavenworth, you asked to go to graduate school and you're told that your grades aren't good enough.
Well, yeah, they were right. I mean, they weren't good enough. But nevertheless, I was doing well in the Army. And the officer who was giving me counseling said, you know, your grades from CCNY just aren't strong enough to get you into graduate school. Sorry. But I pressed it. And so I took the graduate records exam and got into this university, George Washington University. And when I arrived to get my Master's of Business Administration, I had 18 months. And my guidance counselor here, Professor McCarthy, took one look at my undergraduate record and he said, you can't do it in less than 2 years. You're not very smart. And so sitting in his office, he called the Army and said, he looks like a great officer, but you got to give him 2 years and a couple of summer schools. And the Army agreed. And it took a full 2 years, and McCarthy was right. But I graduated from this wonderful university with an A average, and Dr. Trachtenberg is here now, so I don't want to embarrass him. Learned a great deal here.
You know what I was actually thinking about when I asked the question was the fact that you graduated second in your class at the General Staff College.
Right.
And that's what got the attention of people in the military.
Yeah. By time I got to Staff College or got ready for graduate school, some habits of discipline had kicked in, and the Army had taught me enough about hard work and studying, and I had a family to take care of, that I couldn't fool around like I did in undergraduate.
So if you're talking to a kid today who's
Don't
thinking,
follow me.
well, I know, but let's take the good part of the
my
story.
family. My family hated when I wrote in the book that I was such a bad student. But it's true. I have the records. I got the transcripts. And
we trust you. We trust you.
No, it's true.
But so how do you go from being a guy who's a bad student to a guy who's suddenly second in officers' corps?
I had to work very hard. I had to study very hard, and I had to put in extra effort, which is what I tell young people now, that there's no substitute for putting in the work, making the effort, and believing in yourself, and just going after it. And those are traits that I learned in the Army.
Well, then after you graduate from GW, this is 1969?
It was 71.
71. What'd you do next?
Went to the Army back to the Army staff for a while, waiting to see what would come along next. And then the Army told me to apply to be a White House Fellow. And I applied and was selected to be a White House Fellow, which started me in my political career, such as it was then. And I worked in the Office of Management and Budget as in the Deputy Director's Office.
Caspar Weinberger?
Caspar Weinberger initially and Frank Carlucci initially. They became great friends and mentors over the years. We just lost Mr. Weinberger recently. But they went over to HHS, or then HEW, to run it for President Nixon. And I worked for Fred Malek for 9 months.
Well, what was the experience as a White House Fellow? Did they give you serious responsibility, or were you treated as this military guy?
A lot of the time was spent meeting cabinet officers, meeting all kinds of people in Washington. So I learned the Washington scene quite well. And they also allowed us to travel. And in 1972 and 73, I was able to go to the Soviet Union and cross the Soviet Union from the East Coast in Siberia, taking the Trans-Siberian Express for 3 days and then flying to Moscow. And that was an unusual thing for an Army lieutenant colonel in those days. And then the next summer in 73, before I went back to the Army, I went to China for 3 weeks. And I was one of the first Army officers allowed into China since the revolution in 1949. So at that point in my career, I had seen the two great communist giants that I was preparing to fight at some point in the future, if that ever came to pass. So it was quite an educational experience.
Well, why did they give you permission to go?
Because they thought the White House Fellows was an important program. They didn't know they were also going to get a couple infantry officers to go along with the program. But once they realized we were infantry officers, I can assure you they kept very close watch on us.
You go from working in your career from President Carter to President Reagan. Mm-hmm. What happened there?
Well, I've worked for lots of presidents. I mean, I've worked for the last 6, I guess. But I was a White House fellow under Nixon, and then I was a colonel under President Carter and did some work on the Panama Canal treaties, but got back out into the Army, which is where I wanted to be, and was a brigade commander in the 101st Airborne Division. But then found myself back in Washington toward the tail end of the Carter administration, working for then Secretary of Defense Harold Brown. And then Reagan came in, and I went to work for Frank Carlucci and Weinberger again.
And shifting from one party to another, no problem?
I was never in a party, if you mean political party. In those days, I was a professional soldier and had no party affiliation and never expressed any political affiliation whatsoever. In fact, as Reagan's national security advisor, I was a 3-star general. And nobody in the White House dared ask me what party I might be in.
Now, around this time, you got involved in a remarkable project that we talked about earlier, the creation of the Buffalo Soldiers Monument. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was just a simple case that at Fort Leavenworth, which is one of our most historic posts and one of our oldest posts, everyone who'd ever served there had been memorialized. And I was walking around the post, and I never saw anything that recognized the black soldiers that were there. And finally, the historian said, "Oh, no, there are 2 streets down by the cemetery." So I went to look for these 2 streets, 9th and 10th Cavalry Avenue. And they turned out to be 2 unpaved roads going through an abandoned trailer park. So I went back to my headquarters. I was a brigadier general. And I called in the historian. And I said, "That is not going to make it. And so you need to put your thinking cap on, because I want to see an equestrian statue with a buffalo soldier on it, erected on a prominent place in this post, on this post." And it took years. I left and others followed and continued the work, but I was very honored to go back and dedicate the statue some 8 or 9 years later. It's one of the major tourist landmarks in eastern Kansas.
Your career was still on a fast track, so let's take a look.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute
that I will faithfully execute
the office of President of the United States
the office of President of the United States.
By 1986, the politics of the nation had changed, and Colin Powell was appointed Deputy Assistant to President Ronald Reagan. This appointment forced him to leave Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and return to Washington, D.C. By November of 1987, General Powell made history when President Ronald Reagan appointed him National Security Advisor. This was the time of Iran-Contra, the Persian Gulf conflict, Panama, and Noriega. Powell traveled around the world. By 1989, he became Commander-in-Chief of Forces Command, responsible for 1 million troops and all U.S. Army field forces. Colin Powell entered a significant period in his career.
I am most pleased to introduce the man that I have selected to be the next chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Colin L. Powell.
His appointment was historic.
Very pleased to be joining your national security team. I look forward to working with you, the Vice President, and all the members of the team as you face the historic opportunities and challenges that are before us.
Now a 4-star general and the 12th chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Powell would become the soldier of soldiers.
Now, you're the youngest, but you're also the first ROTC man ever to become chairman of the Joint Chiefs.
That's right.
Tell me a story. The whole ROTC explode in joy?
ROTC, yes, they did, matter of fact. Previously, it was expected that West Pointers or Academy graduates would ascend to that. But I was the first ROTC graduate to become chairman, but there were 2 other chairmen who had direct commissions, or OCS. So I wasn't the first non-West Pointer, there were others. But it was an extremely proud moment for me and for the ROTC.
Now, you had 28, I think is the way we've counted them up for HistoryMakers, 28 crises that you dealt with during this time. Does one story stand out in your mind?
Desert Shield and Desert Storm, perhaps, is the one that stands out uppermost in my mind. the whole nation was watching this. It was the first televised war. Not to offend you, but it was the first CNN war. I say that in a generic sense, not a particular network. But it's the first thing that was ever covered like that. And it was also the first time the American people got to see this professional, all-volunteer force at work, and the most technical war anyone had ever seen, with cruise missiles and GPS systems and all sorts of other things that we were using, stealth fighters. And a lot was on the line. Presidency was on the line. And we said to President Bush that if we can't avoid war, we've got to do it with enough force to get it done right. And we did, and we accomplished the mission which was assigned, which was to kick the Iraqi army out of Kuwait.
Now you're in private life. What made you decide to write the memoirs? And you throw a second part to that question, which is you also then found America's Promise. What were you trying to accomplish with that?
Well, the book was something that I was anxious to do. I didn't really think about writing a book until some people said, you really owe this to your family, and you owe it to the American people to kind of describe your life. And so I found that to be an exciting experience once it was over. Like, you're the master of this, not me. But then after the book was out and I decided not to enter political life, we were looking around for things to do. We were quite busy, but looking for something else to do. And President Clinton came to me, and we talked about having a summit for America's young people, where we bring all the living presidents together and launch a campaign. Mrs. Reagan represented President Reagan. He was suffering too badly from Alzheimer's by then. And so we created America's Promise from that summit.
Well, let's go now from the personal back to the professional, because your career in government wasn't over. So let's take a look at this.
In January 2001, General Colin Powell again made history when he was appointed by President George W. Bush as the first African-American Secretary of State.
Pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and I am honored to be given the opportunity to return to public service as the 65th Secretary of State of the United States of America.
9 months later, America would be thrown into chaos because of the events of September 11th. In time, Secretary of State Powell would advocate a more deliberate, consensus-building approach. This approach was criticized by those advocating a more aggressive military response. Secretary Powell called himself a reluctant warrior.
The terrorist threat is global in scope, many-faceted and determined. The campaign against terrorism must be equally comprehensive, multidimensional, and steadfast.
He attempted to assemble an international coalition, and oftentimes he was the lone voice of moderation as Americans struggled to understand September 11th and its aftermath. War was raged on bin Laden, the Taliban, and Al-Qaeda. Afghanistan led to a war on Iraq and Saddam Hussein. Powell stayed the course. After the re-election of President George W. Bush, Powell decided to return to private life.
It has been my great honor and privilege to have been once again given the opportunity to serve my nation. And I will always treasure the 4 years that I have spent with President Bush and with the wonderful men and women of the Department of State. I think we've accomplished a great deal.
Condoleezza Rice replaced him, accomplishing yet another first: consecutive African-American Secretaries of State.
I think there are still challenges out there, but I think there are far more opportunities out there.
General Colin Powell, a loyal servant and eloquent spokesman. The son of Jamaican parentage, this soldier of the highest order, this public servant who has risen to the highest ranks of American government, was now entering the next chapter in his life.
Have you ever thought what your time as Secretary of State would have been like without 9/11?
Sure. I mean, 9/11 was a defining moment, and it came 9 months into the administration. We were just starting to get our sea legs. We were beginning to engage with the Russian Federation on reducing more nuclear weapons. We were just getting over an incident with the Chinese. Remember when our two planes crashed, which could have blown up the relationship, but didn't. And so things were moving in the right direction. And then 9/11 came along, and we found that America had to respond to this new enemy that had infiltrated into our country and caused such a terrible disaster. And the first thing to do was to go after al-Qaeda where they were, which was in Afghanistan. And so that's what we did, and we quickly took out the Taliban. And now, several years later, we see that Afghanistan has a freely elected government, a freely elected president. Women are back in civil society, girls are going to school. The job is not yet done, but we should be very proud of what we did in Afghanistan. Iraq came along, and I always try to avoid war. I've always been called a reluctant warrior, and more power to those who call me such, because I think war should always be a last resort. And I recommended that we take it to the United Nations first, and we did. And we tried to see if we could find a solution, but it was not forthcoming. President Bush and a number of other leaders decided that military force was appropriate, and I supported that. I would have supported a peaceful solution and hoped for a peaceful solution. But when that didn't happen, war came, and I supported using military force. And I'm glad that Saddam Hussein is no longer the president of Iraq, and he's standing in the dock. And I'm glad the Iraqi people now have the opportunity to select their own leaders and decide how they will be governed, and they have a constitution. It's going to be difficult to bring all of this about in a democratic way. They are under enormous pressure from insurgents, from terrorists, and now there's a danger of sect-on-sect violence. It is increasingly in the hands of the Iraqis to work this out. They are now sovereignty. They have their own sovereign government. And we're going to have to stand with them, but increasingly the burden is going to be on their military and security forces and going to be on their political system.
Now, in the clip that we just saw, we saw you giving testimony, if you will, before the United Nations. Mm-hmm. And you were making the case that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Mm-hmm. And you had George Tenet, the CIA director, seated right behind you. Later, it turned out that some of that was not right, not true.
It was, some of it was wrong. The information with respect to his intentions, his capability to have such weapons, and his history of having used such weapons. I've been to the town in northern Iraq where he killed 5,000 people one Friday morning in 1988 with nerve gas. Even though he had intention and capability, he didn't actually have the stockpiles that we thought he had and we said he had. And that was a failure of the intelligence community. But it was what we all believed at the time. And it is what the Senate and the House believed when they passed a resolution 4 months before my presentation. And in the previous administration, President Clinton had to face similar kinds of issues in 1998 when his intelligence folks were telling him that this was a real danger. And he undertook Operation Desert Fox, a 4-day bombing campaign against those kinds of targets.
Now, during this period, there are lots of reports about difficulties between you and some people who had been your patrons. For example, Vice President Cheney, the very man who had recommended you to become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, now as vice president, has a very different point of view about the war effort. Donald Rumsfeld, another person that you'd worked with closely before, different points of view, lots of contention as you go to the president. What about these reports, and does that lead you to decide that you don't want to stay on for a second term?
There were serious debates about all of these issues because these are issues of enormous importance. In most issues, we had agreement, whether it was dealing with the Russians or dealing with the Chinese, sending troops into Liberia to help the African Union get Charles Taylor out, keeping our troops in the Balkans as opposed to bringing them out. All of these are difficult issues, and they were all debated. With respect to Afghanistan, there was no disagreement. We might have disagreed about, what mixed force to send in, but it was successful. The big issue that everybody talks about is Iraq. And I went to the president and said he should try a diplomatic solution. Now, some of my other colleagues didn't think a diplomatic solution would work, didn't think that the UN would be able to deal with this. But nevertheless, the president accepted my recommendation, and the others joined in once it was clear that this is the better way to go. And so we went unanimously with a presentation to the United Nations by the president in September of 2002. So there were debates, there were disagreements. They can't cover it up. We had strong differences of view on different issues. But you know, I'm not the president. Mr. Cheney isn't the president. Mr. Rumsfeld isn't the president. The president heard all of these different points of view, and he is the one who made the decisions. And our jobs, myself, Don, Condi, the vice president, our responsibility was to give the president our best advice in the strongest terms we could, and that's what we did.
Well, is that why you're not in the administration any longer?
I thought 4 years was enough, and I thought that toward the end there was sufficiently strong views that were so differing in moving forward that it'd be better if I ended at the end of one term. And I said to the president, I thought it'd be best if I left after one term, and we left on very good standing with each other.
Yes or no? So if the president or anyone else comes back in the future and says, what about Secretary of Defense? What does Colin Powell say?
Well, you know, Juan, you learn in this business never to answer the hypothetical.
Now, tell me about your legacy. When people are watching this tape in the future, someday when you won't be with us, maybe I won't be here as well, but what do you want people to think about Colin Powell? What's the legacy?
I'm pretty much now what I think I was at the beginning of all of this 50 almost years ago. The one who captures it best is my youngest child, Anne-Marie. And she got asked not too long ago, what was it like growing up with Colin Powell as your father? And she just looks at them, and she's a bit of a smarty. And she said, well, he wasn't Colin Powell then. And the point is, don't take yourself too seriously. And I've been a national security advisor, I've been a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I've been Secretary of State, I've been privileged to have many great jobs and assignment and work for lots of wonderful people. But if it all had ended as just a lieutenant colonel serving 20 years and then going into retirement with my pension, that would have been good too. But I'm just privileged to have had the opportunity to serve, and if people remember me as someone who served well and faithfully, that's enough.
What is Colin Powell thinking about when he's alone these days? You're approaching 70. You are now a wise man of American life. What are you thinking about?
I think about the world a lot. I think about the problems that we still have to work our way through. But you can't just live on problems. You can't just live thinking about problems. It'll depress you. So I also think about the good things that we've been able to do and the new world that we have been able to help create. I think about the fact that we're able to get the peace agreement in Sudan between the North and the South. If only we could do something now in Darfur to end that terrible problem. And so I worry about those things. But I also think about how can we continue to build our relationship with Europe? No world war in Europe. First time in 200 years, nobody's facing a world war in Europe. How do we continue to build on that and bring all the nations into the democratic column? How can we continue to move in the right direction with China and push back on this suggestion that China is going to be an enemy? China's not going to be an enemy. They're selling too much stuff to Walmart. They're not crazy. And they're lending us the money to buy it. I mean, this is... And so I think about how do we build on that. I think about some of the business interests I have in Silicon Valley, and we're looking at new ways of sharing information. We're looking at biomedicine. We're looking at fuel cells and new battery technology. I'm trying to think through how we use these technological breakthroughs to improve the human condition, and especially to help kids in need in our country. And more importantly, how do we help kids in need throughout the world? What can we do about infectious diseases and HIV/AIDS? But I always see problems alongside of opportunities and opportunities alongside problems. I always try to see the good with the bad. Otherwise, you can become rather jaundiced in your view of the world. And it's a great world still, and it's a great country we're living in. It's a country that's still looked up to and respected, even though sometimes it is resented and looked down on. But they're still lining up at all of our embassies to come here. Walk through any community in America and you'll see a diversity that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. As people come here, just get a New York City cab and drive around for a little bit and talk to the driver. And he'll tell you what the real America is all about.
General Powell, I can't say thank you enough for sharing with all of us your remarkable journey. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
For more information or to order your own copy of An Evening with Colin Powell, please visit thehistorymakers.org or call 866-914-1900. That's 866-914-1900. The preceding program was funded in part by Toyota, AT&T, Baldwin Richardson Foods, Lincoln Financial Group, Apple, American Airlines. A complete list is available at thehistorymakers.org.